That was untouched for us.
So first of all, I want to thank everybody, all of you members of the Secular Society for making this possible. As most of you know before that, SFTS has meant a lot to me personally. And a lot of this stuff was actually developed, scratched, and then re-edited later on as a matter of my hours of argumentation with some of the former members of SFTS. And so there were things I wanted to believe very strongly as a matter of my own personal convictions, and they're not in here. One of them is, of course, being the idea of deductively trying to defend individual human rights, which I don't think I can do it. But one can argue for them prudentially. So, anyway, aside from that, so the point of this whole thing becomes, is when I first left Islam, and I guess this has to do with my personality, because I was always convinced that there's some reality out there, and you could explain that reality in some ways. My personal experience came from the Quran and everything that I believed in, and once that was lost, I was trying to find some other things else beyond that. And so, over 10 years, I sort of worked on this thing and kind of came out one after the other, and it was not anything like this. I didn't initially started off to be that, but it became that. Around about the time when I came to ASU in 2008 and I joined SFTS, is when this thing was formulated and one day again re-scratched. Anyways, going back to what we were talking about, the basic idea becomes this: that if you are a skeptic, and I'll broadly define skeptic as somebody who openly wishes to examine the nature of existence, how it exists, then how can you know there are facts out there? How do you know what is true? We talked about it last time I was here, and that there are fundamental problems of knowledge that exist. And so the whole effort of these axioms that I've established is to merely illustrate a point that we can know to some degree of what we call reasonable certainty the truth of the matter. And you can say, well, this is a more reasonable proposition compared to something else that may be out there. So you can see that these axioms are divided. The first three are basically what we call epistemological axioms. That is to say, they say something about how we have any knowledge of anything. The second two are what I call, they're basically part of the same five, what I call etiological, about the first causes as they exist, and or how existence or causation actually happens. The last five are, as we talked last time also, axiological. These are the axioms that deal with our value systems and how do we value things, if you want to value things objectively. Because you can take on a view, a lot of religious people do the same thing. There's an interesting thing with the book that I last read, which led to was my departure from Islam, was Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. At that time, I was practically out of it, but what the book helped me convince was that there were certain things I could no longer argue for. If I cannot show sufficient causation, therefore I cannot believe in them. For instance, angels or afterlife or things of the kind. So it was those minor things that basically propelled me out of the religion, and because and the reason I mentioned was because one thing happens is in this dialogues he talks about this one character who's basically a religious person, but he's also a skeptic. So he will argue that he takes a Kierkegaardian view that therefore you cannot prove God exists, but you feel that, and therefore you become a Christian, so to speak, or any other religious person. There's also Philo the skeptic, who basically argues, who's basically the mouthpiece for David Hume, and Cleanthes, who's a rationalist, sort of a deist or natural theistic philosopher or spokesman over there. And one thing that happens is both religious people and non-religious people, theistic and non-theistic, take a viewpoint which I consider what I call Pyrrhonian skepticism, which is again saying that you have no way of knowing what is right and wrong. It's ultimately radically subjective and all that kind of stuff. And it is against that viewpoint that I argue for what I consider, of course, I started using the term Promethean skepticism, because if you go back to Greek mythology, Prometheus as a god, the word Prometheus means forethought, was a god that gave man reason, gave the ability to think. In one of the plays by, I think it was, I forgot the name of the player, but anyways. Pardon? No. The Averroes, yeah, exactly. He talks about giving man civilization and other arts. Of course, he's the one who brings fire. Zeus becomes angry at men because they're a favorite of Saturn, or Cronus. And so he takes away fire from them. He steals fire back from the god and gives it to mankind. And as a consequence, he's punished. As we know, it is the prototype of Jesus that existed, hundreds of years ago. in terms of the Greek mythology, and he suffers severely. Zeus or Jupiter's eagle pecks his liver out. Every night he goes back, he's chained to the Caucasus. Ultimately, Hercules liberates him. And Prometheus, of course, having the foreknowledge, knew all this was going to happen, but he voluntarily goes to suffering to save mankind. But the idea of Prometheanism, or Promethean skeptic, as I define it, is simply somebody who accepts what he calls, she is a fundamentally a truth seeker and a caretaker. This is a person who says, okay, yes, I recognize there are realities out there, and I will affirm those realities and the fact that I willingly choose to live a life in congruence with other living beings, whether they are bigger or superior or inferior to I am, overall as a disposition. It is a Promethean disposition. So that is essentially what a Promethean skeptic is versus, let's say, a normal skeptic that may affirm what reality is, as opposed to, say, a patriotic skeptic that may be doubtful about what reality is. But a skeptic in a normal sense is basically somebody who is not committed to any particular paradigm. So they are free thinkers, but they may not exactly have a viewpoint of what is the right or wrong viewpoint. Anyways, so going back to the implications of this, I've always argued in the past as well about the idea of what we call existentially necessary axioms. This is something that happens if you engage with Christians or with theists all the time in debates. It comes out sooner or later to the question, how do you know what is true? How do you know where this knowledge is coming from? We talk about things as well, whether it be cosmology, whether it be carbon dating, whether it be anything. It's like, well, how do you know that's true? And ultimately they'll say, well, okay, for instance, one of the weaker arguments that they launch against, let's say, science, is that it's based upon two unproven assumptions. And they are unproven or untested or assumptions that don't come from us from experience necessarily. Those are uniformism and gradualism. Actually, one could argue that does come to us from experience in some ways because the experience has not been violated, but they'll counter-argue by saying, well, no, whenever a miraculous event actually happens, the experience violates it, but we simply bring in the scientific assumption of gradualism and uniformism, and therefore we discount the fact there's been a violation of it, therefore that a miracle has occurred. So they will say it's an assumption that you have, it's an a priori assumption that you have not proven. They have a valid point to a qualified degree over there, that any system of knowledge that exists out there would have certain assumptions. We talked about this idea briefly last time also. What Gödel's theorem proves is that the axioms of any system cannot be justified by the system itself. They have to be taken a priori. Same thing happens with Euclidean geometry. You take the 5 axioms of the 6 axioms of it, and you get the traditional Euclidean geometry. You change the 5th one, which talks about the parallel lines, and you basically do not affirm it. That parallel lines by definition are ones that you go forever in the future and never be together. You change that, you get non-Euclidean geometry. And so what axioms are essentially what Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence are self-evident propositions. He was talking about moral propositions that are evident, but even before you can affirm moral propositions, you have to affirm epistemic and etiological propositions. You have to say something about reality before you can speak about something about morality. And so this is where this stuff comes in, and of course, like I said, it has bearing on true faith, true belief, correct ideas to hold, versus false faith or false belief systems, both in science and in religion. So the first axiom that in my opinion, that one has to affirm, that denying that one cannot continue accomplishing afterwards. And a lot of these axioms sort of kind of follow, they become weaker and weaker the further down you go. So the ones on top are more stronger in that sense. And therefore the epistemic axioms come first, the first being that of identity. They all have other sub-axioms, so otherwise there would be too many, so it's basically easier to put them in 10 by putting them as sub-axioms. The identity, of course, affirms two ideas. One, that of individual identity. I know that I exist. It is a fundamental fact that anybody has to affirm. The denial of the fact affirms the fact that you exist, because a non-thinking, non-sentient being could simply not affirm that statement. It's a meaningless statement. It's like asking a dead person if they're dead. To the dead, it doesn't mean anything. They don't exist. But to a person who says yes or no, it automatically affirms their own individual existence. This is one fact, going back to Descartes, I guess, in Meditations, that nobody can deny. So beyond that, everything else could be denied, possibly. Solipsists would simply say, yes, I know I exist, but everything else does not exist. They could possibly deny this. So these axioms are what I call existentially necessary, and by that simply mean that they are necessary to assume in order to say something about existence. So you can't prove them, you take them, of course, on faith in that sense. It's an assumption you're making. But if you don't have some of these assumptions, you really would not be able to talk to anybody in any meaningful way. I mean, philosophically, you were able to stop them, but in normal conversations about everything else, these would automatically be assumed. Laws of identity. Basically, there's one law of identity, that which what is that which it is. A is A. The other one that's part of it I included into is law of non-contradiction. Basically something, A is what, what's the exact verbiage of law of non-contradiction? Can anybody give me? A is not A. Yeah. So A is not A.
Well, it would be A exclusive or not A. That's
Right. I mean, basically that it becomes that something that which it is not the opposite or not that. I mean, so if something is alive, then it's not the case that it is dead. Now, the law of non-contradiction is slightly different from the law of what we call excluded middle, which says that something must be, let's say, alive or dead. And in the case of Schrodinger's cat, we know that it becomes a matter of disputation whether if nobody's observing it, is it really alive or is it dead? I'm not including the law of excluded middle into the law of identity, but the law of non-contradiction can never be violated. If the law of non-contradiction was violated, you cannot find any knowledge without the law of non-contradiction in any possible universe. Because if you were to say that something is that which it is, but also not that which it is, then any talk about anything simply becomes nonsensical. So it is something that we always assume. Even if you find somebody, and you will find somebody that may question the law of non-contradiction as far as the epistemic knowledge is concerned, in any meaningful conversation, whether it be from politics to fiction to whatever, you cannot violate the law of non-contradiction. And it's important to realize that non-contradiction is not the same as excluded middle. Excluded middle mostly stands, it does not always necessarily stand. Because it makes a claim that there is no middle, there is always either yes or no, black or white, either you're alive or you're dead, or there's either you're standing or you're sitting. But it may be the case that we do not know, or there may be an intermediate position, maybe somebody's hovering in the air or something. But in non-contradiction, it's simply saying that you cannot be both at the same time. But it's not saying that it's not simply putting it in excluded categories of one or the other. Anyway, intelligibility. This is the basic idea that we can understand nature, we can understand existence. So outside of my mind, there is a world out there, and I can understand this. This is again an assumption that's made. There is no proof of this assumption. I mean, my experience relatively tells me so. But there are many things in my experience that I do not understand. As a matter of fact, the basic propositions of quantum mechanics, or for the matter of Darwinian evolution, I do not understand. I actually take them on faith. And again, this would be an issue that is a kind of a faith that I have, which is not existentially necessary. So, because Darwinian evolution could be false, quantum mechanics could be false. I'm not saying that they are, because I do believe they're true. But I'm saying that's, anybody starts with assumptions which are not existentially necessary, versus Jesus Christ, Son of God, is an assumption that is not existentially necessary. Likewise, Darwinian evolution or premises are not existentially necessary assumptions. This is a statement about assumptions that we must accept for having to make any other claims about other things in this world. So, one thing I have to accept is the world is intelligible. That I'm in a relatively in an ordered world, or at least I can understand the order of it in one way or the other, no matter how complex the order is. It does not a big assumption that I would necessarily understand everything, but the fact that things are intelligible. But there are many ways of doing it. Of course, the two proper, one is analogy, the other is inferencing. Analogy simply is an argument that you take from particulars to particulars. So when you see something is like that, you say, well, okay, something that's similar to that would have a similar traits to it. It is an assumption we make all the time, and mostly it is true. Well, the other is inferences, which basically you go from particulars to universals. One of the obvious ways of making inferences are through deduction. You may basically, which is again, you may be looking at premises, and the premises are true. It must be the case that the conclusions will be true all the time if the premises are true. Induction is a more probabilistic form of knowledge, which is simply saying that if the premises are true, it is very likely that the conclusion is also true, but not necessarily. Inferences, abduction, as we talked about last time, of course, is the idea of it's sort of a reverse cause, from effects to cause, and there are problems with it, of course. A lot of our knowledge, empirical knowledge, comes, particularly in the realm of science, does come from abduction, and therefore there are issues with it. We have to recognize those things. Scientists, unfortunately, are not trained in philosophy, and therefore they're not necessarily always as humble in recognizing it. And conversely, when they want to be, there are issues at stake, perhaps, whether it be environmental science, whether it be biology, whether it be cosmology, where they realize that their humility may be taken by the opponents who may have other agendas, and therefore be exploited. So one can sympathize with them as well, as to why they're sometimes rather more adamant upon the strictures or the truth of their claims, even if there have to be limitations on them. This is where the law of parsimony comes in. We already talked about the Hume's delimiter, which is one of the limits on abduction. When you go from that, from effects to causes, you have to realize that you cannot say more about the cause than what you found in the effect. There are limits to the statements of this kind. Likewise, when you find what you call limits on causation, when you find similarities in situations, and you make claims about it, of causations, we should realize that those claims are, well, that there are strong correlations that you have found. You have not necessarily found what you call causation. We assume causation, and it's reasonable to assume causation, but you have not found causation in experience in any whatsoever. It is what that assumption of causation helps us basically, make sense of the world. Occam's razor is the simple idea again of, same idea of parsimony. It simply states that, of all the explanations, the one with the least tied knots, so to speak, with the least unproven assumptions tends to be the right one. So it's not necessarily the simplest. There's a problem with what you call simplicity or aesthetic beauty, and oftentimes those things in mathematics or even in physics or reality are not necessarily always true. But if you have a system that explains things more and leaves less untied ends, it's going to be a system, or an explanation that's going to be a better explanation than the one that does not. So the simple question becomes, let's say, it's a classic way Hume made his argument against miracles. Thomas Paine also made it in Age of Reason, as to what is more likely, that a woman virgin gave birth to a child, or is it the case that a person lied? I mean, you have cases where basically the odds of a virgin birth happening is basically 1,000,000 to 1, according to Thomas Paine, compared to the fact that 1,000,000 people in that same time period could have lied about it. So this is where the question becomes, which is, and that's where the issue of parsimony comes in. In religion, matters of politics, morality, science, is people often have a tendency to claim far more than that. To give another example, so I quickly on the slide, is recently Dr. James Hansen from NASA, who is a significant proponent of environmental, global warming, whatnot. And if you guys went to the symposium recently, a few months back, he was talking about how the whole thing is happening. He has actually admitted to a fact that in the past few weeks that for the past 20 years there has not been what we call overall rise in global temperature. Even though the fact that because of India and China and other parts of the world, there has been a tremendous rise in carbon dioxide production. The most plausible explanation is, there are two explanations. The most plausible one is the what you call the carbon dioxide being taken by the plants, and they're basically embedding it back into the ground, because there's an exponential growth in the foliage or biomass across the world as well too. So for the past 20 years, there's been no increase in what you call in as far as the increase in CO2 exponential, there's been no increase in global temperatures. Conversely, the other possible explanation for that is the sulfur dioxide, which helps basically repel sun rays, which will be the consequence of having more coal being exploited. And the point, again, bringing that is that we can see that whenever we get very sure about our inductive sciences or about our abductive sciences conclusions, there are always going to be some, so-called proverbial black swan out there that may throw the whole thing off. As skeptics, we must recognize this. Even if we do believe it in proposition A or B, or whatever it is true, that can be proven to be wrong. And oftentimes the basic assumptions are, well, they can be flaky. People can be very flaky, or maybe, Anyway, so that's the idea of parsimony. It's something that we consider 3 epistemological axioms that we have to accept. Now, how we implement it in our lives, of course, everybody has prejudices, I have prejudices, and we have tendencies to basically sometimes discount them. But we can never formally discount them. We have to recognize that this is how we make sense of reality, of knowledge. Then comes the idea of existentiality. It's to say that there is an existence outside of my mind that does exist. Again, it's an affirmation. It's entirely possible that my mind is plugged into some kind of matrix, but even in that mind that's plugged into a matrix, there is a fact that there is a reality that my mind is experiencing. And in my own mind, I can see the difference between, let's say, my own personal imaginations versus the limitations of my, actions. We talked about it last time as well too. I can imagine myself, on the moon right now, but at the same time, I cannot imagine myself, I cannot practically be on the moon right now. There are limitations of technology that prohibit my instantaneous transportation, unless I was living in the Star Trek world, of course. So there is an assumption that there's a reality out there independent of my mind. That reality is divided into two forms. One, of course, is what we call temporal reality. This is the spatial temporal bounded reality, which is dimensional, is space-time oriented, and material. You cannot assume, you cannot prove matter exists. No proof of matter can ever exist. But there is, again, an assumption that there is some substance out there that is inert, that we act upon, and its properties change over time, versus, let's just say, our conscious experience. So that inert matter out there is what we call material. Now, this is an issue of maybe some problems some people may not 100% agree with this. I'm not fully familiar with it, but I grant this for the sake of argument that personally, that the temporal reality cannot be eternal. It cannot have infinite regression. The past issues of that that come about. Some of us have discussed about these things. I admit that I do not fully understand them in the details, but as much as there is no, if we grant the premise that temporal reality cannot go back eternally in the past, there cannot be infinite regression of time and space, nor that matter can be infinitely existent, either in quantity or perhaps back in duration of time, then we have to realize that there has to be an eternal reality out there. This comes from basic, what you call the idea comes from Parmenides, the claim that ex nihilo nihil, that there is out of nothing does not come nothing, out of nothing comes nothing. So there has to be something out there. Whatever something is the ground of being would be called the true substance, as we talked about. It's basically which understands all existence, the ground of being, therefore. And it would necessarily be singular, because there are problems, of course, with division occurring in there. If it's non-singular in its own nature, then you are basically going into issues of basically what comes first, or infinite regression as well. So there is going to be an eternal reality, and there's going to be what we call temporal reality. Our reality, as we experience right now, is the temporal reality, but it does not make a difference whether there is such thing as a divided between eternal and temporal. It is my current understanding that there is, or necessarily should exist, but the fact is that whatever it is, we experience a reality of existence outside of our mind, which includes our body and everything else. The fifth one is the principle of sufficiency, which again, coming from Parmenides, is that everything, the idea of something cannot come from nothing, is that everything has to have a cause. The better translation for the word cause from Greek is explanation. Everything must necessarily have an explanation. And if it does not have an explanation, then well, you cannot explain it. You cannot even say that it does not, you couldn't even talk about it. So in order to intelligently talk about something, you have to assume that it has explanations. There are two forms of explanations. Efficient explanation, which is we normally call causation. So if if I have a dust in my hand and I apply force to it, it goes up and the gravity pulls it down. So my throwing it up, of course, was an efficient cause, and then the gravity is the second efficient cause, that is, or cause that creates the effect, hence the term efficient cause, or efficient explanation for why it comes down. This is an assumption we always make for all understanding of things in the world. The other cause that Aristotle talked about, he talks about four causes: efficient, formal, material, and forgot the fourth one, doesn't really matter. But I collapsed them into basically one, simply broadly speaking, formal causes. Formal causes are the ones which basically, formal explanations have to do with the structure of something, the form of something. Hence, it is formal in that sense. And they are fundamentally three ways of looking at it in our world. There is the material, the vital, and the rational. These are the things that give form to something. If you're talking about things that a human beings have created, such as, for instance, a watch or a whiteboard, you're talking about basically a teleological or a rational cause. That's the thing that gave form to it. So a sculpture is created by a sculptor, yeah. And therefore it is that is the formal cause, the rational cause of it. The same thing happens in the living world of what we call the vital cause, or the other word would be teleonomic, that all living things have fundamental causes built into them. There are certain functions that they will perform. An organism or an organ will always have a function, and it's not possible to describe organs, or even for them that are basically what an organism is, without ascribing a cause to it, explanation to it as to why it exists, what is the purpose of it. Imagine an anatomy book or a biology book that talks about, let's say, the function of a heart or liver, without describing merely the anatomy of it, without describing what its functions are. It will simply not make any sense. The same thing happens at the level of matter itself. The thing is, so I call them teleological, teleonomic, and teleomatic. Material causes are not of the type, they don't have the direction as we think in terms of, living things do, like a heart, for instance, or an ant, for instance, or the way we create structures as human beings do. They don't have that in them. But they are broadly, and the funny thing is, the more back you go into more primitive substances, from rational mind to a living thing, to sentient being, to merely matter, what you have are basically the fact that all of material matter is governed by laws of nature, as we call them, hence Eudaimonia. So there is no, as such, a direct direction to them, as such a purpose to it, but clearly there is governance in there. We assume that the material world is a cosmos, not chaos. It is not empty, it is not without order, it is cosmos, it is ordered reality. There are implications of this idea that we talked about, perhaps if we get time, Aaron and I will talk about next time, as to what it means with the idea of cosmic telos, or the purpose to the universe, perhaps. But it's not time to get into it right now. It's not really relevant, it's just a hypothesis. When last time Adam asked me the question, and I said, I'm not necessarily an etiological nihilist either, but I do think there is a direction to the universe that we exist in that has to come with the idea of the formal causes in this, in matter existence in the universe itself. But that's not relevant right now. The sixth one is reflexivity, which is, I'm not going to go into it, this has to do a lot with my political beliefs, but broadly speaking, it is the idea of interpoesy, and indeterminacy. Reflexivity in itself simply means the fact that whenever a sentient being, or rational being like us, when we make effects, when we work upon things, we in turn change those things. So systems become more dynamic, they're not static. It is the same idea, for instance, as similar to the idea of Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, that observations make the measurements less accurate, or perhaps the fact that you are measuring the momentum, you cannot accurately measure the position of the particle. And therefore, the fact that we are constantly being affected by things, and therefore affecting them in turn as well, and also changing our opinions about those things, create what we call, indeterminacy. Poesy is a word from which the English word poem comes from. It means to create something. And therefore, intrapoesy is the assumption that we create our own reality. Now, the funny thing is that intrapoesy implies that we create our reality together. You're born in a reality, in a culture that gives you values, that gives you ways to look at the world. So clearly, intrapoesy is true. We all of us, our culture, this whole society, it creates our value systems. But it's also true that individuals also affect those things by, for instance, a lot of us over here have actually changed our viewpoints on matters of religion when we left our old-time faith. Others who may have had the luxury or the comfort to not be born in any religious group whatsoever, or still probably changed their views on some of their issues. So even though there were values that were given to us, we were not merely receptacles of those values. We have been also analyzing them and changing them. I want to make sure that people realize that intrapoesy is not an argument for free will necessarily. I personally do believe in free will, but that is not an argument. It simply says that the individual makes decisions and changes it. And those decisions are made by the individual brain, and they're not what we call merely effects of the society on them. There are further sub-axioms of these things, but we go into too much in detail, so I won't go into that. Seventh, of course, is vitality, or self-preservation, and self-promoted propagation. This is again a teleonomic principle at the level of organisms, which broadly states the fact that every single organism has two body functions. One, of course, at the level of genes, when the first replicators arise, we had simply what we call self-propagation. So the individual replicators will propagate themselves, and so on and forth. When you get more complex organisms, you get sentient organisms. The idea of self-preservation arises at the very basic level, as I said, the level of the cell. What you had was the idea that you preserved yourself, or it preserved itself only to the point where it will replicate, and therefore the original parent cell would die out, but the daughter cells would stay alive. So preservation and propagation were advanced. By the time you get to animals, mammals, human beings, self-preservation becomes more and more important, and it is still tied to propagation, because human individuals is not sufficient anymore for them to merely propagate, their species. We are no longer bounded by, we are bounded by our genes, but we live in a different world. We live in the world of mind, so we are bounded now more and more by means. And therefore, for the cultivation, for the advancement of means, to have means, to get more and more means, to get more and more ideas in ourselves, we need to preserve ourselves. The older the human being gets, the more wise that person becomes, the more experience they are able to get. And therefore, it is hence the utility of having older people around. So, whereas perhaps in nature it may not be the case. but you can see that our bodies are deteriorating the older we get, so the advantage of direct genetic propagation starts to fall out. But the older the person gets, generally speaking, the better they are for mimetic propagation. So there, that still remains as two valid principles for all organisms, but particularly for human beings, or rational thinking people. Morality, as some of you were there to debate with the President, I defined it as the objective definition of morality. First of all, morality is simply the doing of good. If you do good, the question becomes this: what is the definition of good? Subjectively, it's simply that which pleases you. I find it good. Objectively, if one comes to a definition of morality, and this again, this has to be taken out axiomatically, but it's not an arbitrary definition. It's simply something that can give you what you call a criteria without assuming other things. For instance, I could define good as obedience to God. The problem with that is, it is assuming God already exists. I could define good as obedience to communal values, and whatever those things are. The problem, of course, is that different communities have different value systems and everything. It is not so easy. If you want to get a very basic definition of objective definition of what morality actually is, aside from the subjective one, which is simply what pleases me. So that's what good is. If morality is a doing of good, then the objective definition requires two things. One, of course, is, well, you have to be wanting to do that good, of course, so intention does matter. But it is the fulfillment of function, the fulfillment of destiny, the fulfillment of purpose. Now, the question becomes this: what is the purpose? And that, of course, comes later, and probably won't get into it, but anyway. At the basic level, the idea of function is the same thing that, and we talked about in the past with a lot of you people over here, that if you're talking about, for instance, that from a professional point of view, from a cultural point of view, a great athlete is a person that basically is able to, or let's say a great car driver, or a race car driver, is able to, the faster and the safer they are while driving it, the better they're fulfilling the function, therefore the better they are. Same thing happens, of course, at the level of what you call human beings. If you can define the parameters of what a human being is and what their function is, then whoever fulfills the function best is therefore by definition a better human being. Whoever fulfills intentionally malfunctions in that case, then is basically a worse human being. In that sense, again. So the idea, the ninth one is the idea of felicity, which is the translation I have used for the Greek word Eudaimonia, which means happiness of spirit, but more in terms of happiness, in terms of a rational happiness, enlightened happiness. And it has two assumptions. One is that's basically that of satisfaction. Every living creature aims to satisfy themselves. This is a fundamental truism that should be accepted. We all satisfy. Now, we, in the process of satisfying ourselves, could even destroy our lives, but we are aiming to satisfy ourselves to find our own happinesses. Perhaps the happiness is in being close to God. But again, it is still a form of happiness that we all aim towards. Animals aim towards satisfaction. Every living creature aims towards their own satisfaction. The second idea of eudaimonia felicity is that it gives a definition of who we are. And this system is for who we are. We are humans, but for any other being that is like us, it will be true for that too. We are rational, congressional animal. And I chose the word congressional, I was simply say social. But when Rachel says we are social animals, he really means we are, political animals. Back in the day of the city-states, of course, the politics and society were so fundamentally intertwined with each other that we could not make a distinction between them. So I use the word congressional because to be in Congress with each other means to have congruence, and of course it implies the political aspect of it as well. But anyways, so we are rational social animals. And therefore, when we seek our satisfaction as rational, congressional, social, political animals. Now, the thing is that these ideas are rather sometimes in conflict with each other because of the nature of our mind, which is precisely why we can find not only what Sam Harris says that in the moral landscape, many peaks and many valleys. There is no one absolute right out there. There are many right outs there, and there are many wrongs out there. But we can generally agree what's the right or what the wrongs are. The other thing is, oftentimes when people deliberately choose to do what others will consider simply as a wrong behavior, or simply because there are different conflicts within themselves that are going on. This has to do with the basic, sort of archaic way of looking at the world in terms of the human mind. The Freudian conception of a division of it, which is the self, the ego, the conscious, the superego, and the it, what I call the underego. That's the animal side of ourselves. That's where the the basic reservoir of our feelings and our needs are coming from. And it is in these concept of these, whichever side of it is actually more dominant is the one that will basically, so the ego yourself is the one that makes the decisions, but the question is, if your conscience or internalized values are more dominant, then of course you will not make certain behaviors that be, let's just say, maybe detrimental to you or to society. If the it or the underego is more dominant, then clearly you will end up making decisions that perhaps may be detrimental to yourself or to society. So the conscious self, of course, is the ego. The subconscious part is where the superego and the underego come in. And these are the ones basically, which one you cultivate the most is going to be the one that's eventually going to, for the most part, win out in your decisions. And that's where the last axiom comes in, that's the equanimity, from Greek Ataraxia, or non-disturbance of mind. It is the secular version equivalent to the ideas of nirvana or moksha in Buddhism and Hinduism, respectively. And its two basic dispositions are agape, which is a term that Aristotle and Plato use, but it's also a Christian term, which means basically the idea of sometimes translated as selfless love. I would say it is basically what he called self-transcending love, not necessarily selfless love. And hypocrisy, which is the idea we got borrowing from Greek skeptics, and as that's to say, that of non-judgmental attitude, holding back one's decisions. I've said in the past in some of the conversations that it is recognizing that there can be different point of views and not holding people in contempt. So it's this is where basically the broader theories of Jungian psychology and something that I'd expect to go into it. I won't go into this right now. But equanimity or ataraxia is a very important idea to have, because if you want to attain felicity as a rational social animal, if you want to satisfy yourself, everybody pursues their happiness, but you want to do it in the right way, it is important to not only think of the right ideas, and you can all think of the right ideas, but to behave upon them consistently, you have to develop your subconscious, otherwise known as the spirit. The spirituality is where it comes in, of course. It's simply about the way Plato used the word spirit, of course, was similar to what we use as conscience. We often use the word in English, or it is our archaic term when we talked about this is a horse being, or somebody being of a high spirit. That's when basically you say that the sort of their animated part, their animal part of it is, they're full of energy. So what you're doing over here is this, as Plato would give the analogy, is that your body, your spirit is, or your body actually, it is like a high spirited, high energy horse. Your mind is the one that basically is the rider, and your conscience is sort of the stirrups that you're able to govern the body with. And how good of a person you are in training your body and how much control you have over it is the part that basically helps you guide yourself to it. And the goal of spirituality in achieving non-disturbance of mind is that therefore the emotional peaks and valleys that come from the feelings of ecstasy or depression, anger or remorse, these things are the ones that create turmoil not only in our lives but in the lives of everybody else around ourselves. If a person is able to achieve what he calls sort of a depth of a constancy, that person can therefore govern their life in a way where they will not, by doing the right thing, fulfilling their function, being morally good, will not be affected by the outcome. That person will not care for the outcome, because what they will do that good is for the sake of good itself. That will be the reward unto itself. It is not a selfish reason for doing, like the way religious people do it, because God will please them, or perhaps it's not a way to live because somebody else will, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back. It would be something. It would be the good would be the reward for itself unto itself. So developing the concepts of agape and hypocrisy, both transcendental, self-transcending love, and hypocrisy as not holding anybody in contempt, and these are very difficult things to do. There are ways of doing it, but developing it is actually very important for other things to achieve, particularly the kind of rational social happiness that we talk about. Lastly, some of the assumptions, these are not the axioms of it, but these are the ideas that I found from reflexivity, some of the other assumptions. My political belief, of course, is that of liberalism, in the classical sense of the word, which has two axioms of individualism and republicanism. But individualism at the political level, again in politics, we are dealing with a force and how to organize communities through force, versus in society. I had Thomas Bennigan made a really good observation, and I think it was in either Rights of Men or in Common Sense, I forgot, that people often conflate society and government together, whereas one has always existed and will always exist, whereas the other, government, can collapse and get, and is basically an artificial prop. Governments, as Aristotle will say, are naturally, they're always. I mean, anybody who's an anarchist or anarcho-capitalist or socialist anarchist may disagree with the statement, but at least Aristotle would argue, and most would agree, that from a prudential point of view, in more advanced complex societies, some form of government, or then define the government as a coercive apparatus, would exist in order to create what you call control and whatnot. But precisely because the state is going to be a coercive apparatus, it has to have limitations. And of course, for those limitations, one of course is the recognition of individual rights, which is to body rights and property rights. The second, of course, is that the state itself would be a republic, the term is public good in Latin, I believe, and which would be both a democracy and a confederacy. And again, these are not axioms; these are more prudential ideas coming from my own understanding of things, which is sort of therefore it's merely elaborating what these things mean. A limited local form of governments, and of course they have to be democratic for again prudential reasons. Secularism is a form of ethics. Originally in the 19th century, the term secularism was coined. It was actually used as a moral and even a religious term. It was considered a religion unto itself. So when religious people say talk about secularism as a religion, technically they're correct, but it's also misleading. Secularism, of course, secular means to be of this world and to live and and to talk about this world. So it simply refuses to talk about anything that happens in the metaphysical realm or particular beliefs in Europe. It assumes what you call but secularism itself is basically what you call moral proposition. In the 18th, 19th century, when they first came up with the term, they were talking about basically morals to do good and to do right and what those morals are without going into these religious debates. And so my entire scheme of systematic skepticism and in particular of its ethics, and there are about 10 of those, 12 of those over there itself. Two of them are already mentioned over here, Agape and Coffee. They will be broadly categorized as secular ethics. They're secular because they're coming out of the system, but they're coming out of a system that is not ecclesiastical. So hence, my ethical beliefs are secular, and my political beliefs are liberal, libertarian, classical liberal. But they're not exactly those things. These are not axioms of any kind whatsoever. They are somewhat derived from these things, prudentially. So that's pretty much actually, yeah. That's the basic idea.
And we're gonna miss you.
Yeah, same here. Thanks. I'm going to stop over here because I don't think I can go to the other parts of it. So, but yeah. So basically, this is the system of skepticism that I was talking about. And like I said, I do consider these 10 axioms to be something that are reasonably self-evident. You may argue with perhaps, and I would like to hear disagreements from people. But I would argue that the broader category, these definitions have to be accepted because not accepting them would mean either at the epistemic level or the theological level, inability to talk about stuff. At the axiological level, relativism. So, and like I said, with relativism or the kind of more nihilism, like Catholicism, I cannot necessarily argue against them because you take a strict patriotic approach to things, then these are not, like I said, these are assumptions you're making. But what I'm saying is if a person is willing to talk about, let's just say, value systems, then they will have to accept a lot of these assumptions. They may add on to it, they may subtract a sub-axiom here and there. Some axioms, of course, are tied together. For instance, you cannot have the idea of function without attention in human beings and other things. But in other axioms, there are the sub-axioms, but the overall, they are, in my opinion, from my discussions with a lot of my friends, and some of you over here, I think that they hold water. So, anyways, so, any questions? Yes.
In many of these cases, perhaps most of them, I can't really begin to discuss them or disagree anyway, because I didn't actually hear the axiom. I just heard a discussion of concepts, but not assertions. So just to take one example, the last one, equanimity. What is the actual axiom there?
Good point. I'll actually look at it up, actually.
I feel like it's
To give you,
sorry.
okay. To give you sort of a fair explanation of it is well, ataraxia is the idea of, it's the state of equanimity simply, or ataraxia itself is the state of non-disturbance. And so the assumption is that in order to be a morally good person, in order to fulfill morality, in order to do it in a way that fulfills your function, it is necessary to be in a state of non-disturbance. That is to say, therefore, and this is right, this is one of the, of course, I did not go into the more details of it as to how does one achieve those things, but the simple idea becomes equanimity is a person whose rational conscious self is in harmony with their non-rational subconscious self. Their reason, their intellect, and their emotions are in harmony with each other. Clearly, you need emotions to make decisions, but the emotions do not overpower the rational self or the intellect. And neither is the intellect so dry or something that it does not have any emotion correlated to it. So it is the idea of basically non-disturbance. To be fair to you, I have not precisely worded actually most of these what you call axioms as to give an exact definition of it. But that would be the ballpark definition of what equanimity actually stands for.
But what you just said didn't even include the concepts of agape and euphoria.
Well, the idea becomes as if you're, okay, in order to be the kind of person that actually does not, has what you call attains or tries to attain non-disturbance and sort of a harmony between the subconscious and the conscious, or the rational and the non-rational. The two ways to do it, of course, is the ways to do it, I guess, are these. I guess you actually in that case you're kind of right. This is not exactly what you call sub-axioms per se, as the way other ones are, but these are two more like approaches to it. The epochy approach is the one that's given over here, is to realize where people are coming from, the fractal paradigms that are, bringing it. And the agape approach is to basically look at your subconscious and how basically you can use these different aspects of things through different training exercises to let's see, make yourself, I guess, self-transcendently loving, I guess, would be the term. So, but you're right. These were not exactly equal. You'll say sub-axioms in the way the other ones are. Did you have a question?
You can go first.
Okay.
I kind of, do I take you to mean that you are proposing that the ego, the superego, and the id are actual things, or are they just? Are you saying that they're convenient ways to describe?
This is a problem because yes, they're not real things clearly. This is basically a structure of the mind. This is only a sort of a topographical map of how the mind is. It explains what you call phenomena of why human behaves that way. For instance, the fact is, and I've said this in the past to others as well, that you can divide the mind in thousands of ways actually if you want. You can have 1,000 different categories of things, and that's perfectly fine too. It's the same thing as versus in biology when you deal with taxonomy. How do you classify a species or subspecies? At the very basic level, it becomes rather somewhat subjective. The same thing's happening over here. Is the reason I chose a tripartite division, aside from the fact, of course, that it comes from Greeks, but also not only the early form of philosophy, but early form of psychology in the 20th century. But it's because I cannot, any division less than that, either presentation of the mind as a one unified whole, or dividing into two parts, is insufficient division, in my opinion. The minimum you need to have is a tripartite division of the mind into basically the animal self, or the emotions and the other parts, the body part, the conscience, and the rational self, the decision maker. And so therefore, since that's the minimal division that has to exist in order to have any approach of sufficient explanation of why humans behave the way they do behave, I stick with the tripartite division. Clearly, there is actually within this another division, sort of you might say, kind of horizontal division between the conscious and the subconscious that's already assumed in there too. So you can say that basically the structure goes this way. This is the ego, the underego. This is the ego over here, and then you have what we call the conscious and the subconscious. So it's sort of a vertical division in a way of speaking, and then a horizontal division. And between these ideas of conscious and subconscious, and the divisions as ego, underego, and superego, it is sufficient to explain behaviors of human beings in many ways. But this is just merely what we call an exploratory division. not an actual division of the margin. So,
Okay. The other thing I wanted to bring up was when you talked about James Hansen, the actual claim he made was not that global temperatures are cooling, but that the rate of an increase is not as high as we thought it was going to be. It's still a fast increase. It's just not as big, not as strong an increase as we thought it was going to be. As the model predicted. So we still, for the past 15 years, we've had the hottest temperature, the hottest average temperatures each year for the past 15 years.
okay, fair, yes. But I mean, to be clear, I only brought up merely as an example of, how possibly we can think of things and we can be sure of them and they may not be exactly the way they are. And you're correct, I mean, sure. It's just illustration.
Okay.
So, I mean,
So I apologize, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. It seems like a lot of information for a single presentation. Are you trying to say that these 10 axioms need to be accepted in order to have any type of meaningful philosophical debate? Is that what you're trying to say, or?
no, yes, yeah, I initially started by saying that, I was simply qualified by saying that the existentially necessary axioms for, as far as reality is concerned, are these over here, generally 5 of them.
Right.
These, in my opinion, are necessary for making discussions on morality. So if you can divide existence into 2 forms, there's reality and discussions on that, and then there's morality and discussions on that. Or you can say there are metaphysical discussions, or there are physical discussions, and there are meta-ethical discussions. Or physical or ethical, and therefore there are metaphysical assumptions and meta-ethical assumptions over here. So these are the fundamental assumptions that that one has to accept, for instance, in order to make often certain claims. So about what is good or what is bad. For instance, just to simply take a simple example. Let's just say we come to an objective idea of what good is, and let's just say it's murder is one of the criteria. So should we prohibit people from murder? Well, the understanding is, well, yes, we should. But to what degree should we prohibit people from committing murder? Should we basically completely disarm them entirely? And this is where the assumptions, let's just say, of reflexivity come in, is the indeterminacy built into the system and whatnot. And one therefore has to take this into consideration before, let's say, one comes to a conclusion of that particular course of action to take.
So you're saying 6 through 9 is basically to a certain degree of a certain extent of how it is, and then 1 through 3 is like a off and on, or 1 and 0. It has to be either or, right? Is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry, repeat that again?
With the 6 through 9, you're saying it all comes down to an argument of to what extent is it right or wrong. There's no 1 or 0. It's like a gray or a shade of something. Whereas the arguments of 1 through 3 are either yes or no, or
Sure, yes. I just start by saying that the ones on the top are the most obvious, and without them, they hardly can walk me. Let's just say you deny.
this is all about our reality that we live in, right?
Yes, I mean the thing is, it's a funny question because it's an interesting question because the only reality we can talk about is our reality, and or what our mind can think of. So we can say, as far as I'm concerned, in any possible universe, the universe cannot be breached. Now, could there be the universe where it could be breached? Well, as far as I'm concerned, I cannot see, I cannot imagine, I cannot even talk about it. So, in as much all reality is, fundamentally dependent upon you as the observer observing it. You have to, say yes, in every possible single world, that's not going to happen. You cannot break law by entity. Or conversely, so these basic ideas become, now when it comes to the existence, of course, they also have to be granted in order to have any meaningful conversations about existence. I mean, now these are the ones that have direct implications upon moral behavior.
Okay.
And the idea is not just simply recognizing the truth points where equanimity comes in, is not on the matters of what the truth of right conduct is. This is an axiom which simply states that if you want to make yourself somebody who easily follows good, who does the right thing consistently and easily, without regret, without remorse, because it has happened to all of us, right, where you, let's just say, help somebody and then you feel regret afterwards. And because I personally believe that nobody can exceed their threshold of goodness, but and when they do, they feel bad about it. So they do the good thing makes us feel good, but when you exceed your threshold, it makes you feel bad about it. But you can improve your threshold. You can improve over time, and when you improve upon it, then of course, yes, then you can do more good. But whenever, so that's where the issue of equanimity comes in this actually. So that's why it's at the very bottom of it actually. The others directly deal with the issues of morality directly.
And go ahead. If someone else has a question, go ahead.
Oh, well, I had a parenthetical question to fit
sure.
inside that is, can you give an example that we can all relate to of when you help somebody and feel bad about it? Because I'm not sure what you're getting at there.
Okay, well, I can give my own example. Let's see, I've done this.
Like, fuck, that was my last cigarette kind of thing?
No,
Or?
no, well, okay, that, I mean, yeah, that's a simple example.
Okay.
That, where somebody comes to you and says, hey, can I borrow a cigarette? And that normal custom among smokers is that they will let them a cigarette. And so you're fine, give the person a cigarette. And at the same time, you realize that, of course, that you have given more than what you wanted to give. You gave it at the spur of the moment. There was an emotional response of being courtesy, of, basically we are all programmed to do it, and we responded to that. But our inner disposition was that, well, to me, I mean, if I was thought about it for a second, I would not have, given the cigarette, because I needed a cigarette myself. Now again, the problem, of course, is smoking is, I'm not endorsing smoking over here as a moral thing, but give the parameter of the example. Yeah, so, I mean, it functions that way. There have been tests done in, in laboratories where you can see human beings when you ask them to give something, and you ask them to make instantaneous decisions, they will actually give more. If you make them think about it for a few minutes and deliberate upon that, they will actually give less. The whole point of this is to become the kind of person that deliberates and still constantly gives more. Now, again, here lies the problem. Giving more can become things like foolish. It could become non-prudential. So, there are people who just simply, say that, you can't hold on to their money. And that is, of course, not the kind of person to become. The kind of person you ought to become is somebody that is overall generous towards other people. To take one virtue, I mean, giving off a cigarette is an example of being a generous person. A small example, but still an example of it. And without feeling regret, and the only way you become a person who does that without his own regret, without feeling regret, is if that action in itself is a reward unto you. It's the same thing that people do with their children, which happens naturally, with their friends, or when ultra-patriotic people, gladly join wars and go die for the country, they do it without regret. Conversely, if somebody joins, let's say, the military apparatus, and that was because they wanted to use it to gain other things with them. Or there's a really good movie of that, like Born on the 4th of July, with Tom Cruise in there. And he's this kid, he's really gung-ho, he's got a college, high school job, Vietnam War start, he joins the military, and people know that he's going places. He's got a great, girlfriend, everything is perfect for him. When he comes back from war, A, he did not know what the war was for, so he does not believe in it anymore. And B, he's actually, he becomes a cripple. I think his legs go off or something. As a consequence of that, his girlfriend dumps him. He becomes he's got other issues. People in society are not respecting him because Vietnam War was very unpopular, and he gets more and more bitter. So the question becomes, why? And the answer is because his understanding of what good was predicated upon social people, others, basically praising him. His entire life being this, the one person who was rather, praised by society in which he was growing up. He thought therefore he was a good person, he will do the right thing for his country, and get the honor in the eyes of other human beings, whereas to finding honor within his own eyes. The sole idea of being a sort of a caretaker kind of a person, a good person, is to never do things for the sake of what others are thinking, but simply do it because you know it is right. And when you know things are right and you do them, and again, you think it out, because if you give the cigarette to somebody without thinking that there are remorseful consequences, but you think it out, but then you end up doing the right thing, in spite of the fact you thought it through. So, yeah.
Why did you even think we'd still be here?
That's what I was thinking today, wasn't it?
I'm just interested as to why you think 1 through 3 are so self-evident. I feel like, I don't know how to put this, is there not a possibility that we're incredibly ignorant and stuck in a status quo, we'll never be able to understand the next level? For instance, like a 2-dimensional object trying to interact with a 3-dimensional object, it's just too far beyond them, it's not possible to reach.
Well, before you answer that, I was wondering if we actually did a poll. Since the first 5 you're saying are so necessary for everyone to believe. Take a poll, everyone in this room. Yes, they agree with all of them.
Okay.
No, they don't agree with all of them.
Right.
Maybe 1 or more.
Yeah.
And 3, not sure or don't know.
And first, can we define
Information now.
necessary to believe? Like, are we saying necessary to function? Or
Necessary to have an intelligent conversation about reality. So
that's so subjective.
Okay, well,
Is
here's
Can you lead the poll? Because you can
Yeah,
count
you
it.
can smoke
Bunch
it.
of pot and figure out it.
All right, who's got the weed?
All right, here's the
Doesn't mean
okay.
that-
Do you want to talk about the first 5 or just the first 3?
Let's talk about it.
First.
Well, even the fourth one I
Five.
find interesting. He
Let's say first
says,
5.
Okay. So how many people over here believe that? And again, if you have problems with what these things mean, I'll reiterate them. But who believes that the first 5 are ideas that you should hold on to, or you should, that any conversation that you're going to have, in order to make it meaningful, you have to assume those 5. Okay, only 2 people. That is actually interesting. So the majority of you either disagree or.
well, let's see what the other 2 answers are.
I'm sorry?
What were the
Let's
other
do the
2?
next 2, whether it's no or whether it's not sure or don't know.
Okay, so aside from the Brittany and Tom, rest of you, are you disagree with them, or you're not sure that they're necessarily true?
One at a time.
Whoa.
He said don't know first. Don't know
Okay,
first.
all right, okay. So you don't know for sure this is true or false. Okay, so you got 3 of them. John.
Okay. Not sure or don't know due to lack of understanding, perhaps.
Wait,
That's the
Would
category.
you get it? Okay. Okay. One last
Let's
one.
Adam,
What
why don't you do
category?
this?
Yes.
What?
Why don't you do this?
Yeah.
Because I'm not, keeping count.
Stand
but that's
up.
all I'm
So
saying.
I'll count. You just state the question.
So we got 2, we got 3.
So what I was grouping together was really hard to tell apart, but it's either that you're not sure if you agree or you don't know if you agree. Not sure would be if you understand all 5 of them, but you haven't decided. And don't know would be if you just
This is too
not
much
even
shit.
sure if you understand
Okay,
all 5.
all right, so
Either way.
those of you that understand what this is, but are not sure of it.
Well, I was just grouping them together. If you want to separate
Adam, do
yeah.
it. You're the one that has this
Yeah.
idea in your head.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're not communicating it well to any of us.
But yeah, why
No,
don't
I
you
get it.
you lead the poll and
Yeah.
then so.
Well,
He's making a distinction there.
So 2 said yes, 3 said I don't know.
So the next question is, who in here does not agree with all 5 of the first axioms?
Yeah, why not? Fuck it.
Okay, that's interesting.
Wait, you don't know?
All right. Well, I mean, do you actually disagree, or you're are you inclined?
Just to make sure I've got this completely understood, you said on the 4th one that nothing can come from nothing, right? With the existentiality?
Something cannot come from nothing.
And isn't the original proponent of the Big Bang Theory was that?
No.
No? Okay, see, that's what I'm asking. I don't know.
Well, okay. Do you believe the Big Bang Theory?
No.
Okay, how about this? Okay, that's an
So
interesting
I mean,
question.
because we're asking about what you believe and not what somebody else
Okay,
believes.
that's an interesting question too. But let's assume for a second that
What? Isn't those masters always here or not?
the problem with the Big Bang Theory is this, that the Big Bang simply says that when you basically go back in time, because the world is expanding, of course it was collapsing, right?
Right.
Or the world was not collapsing, but it was smaller. So it goes back to a point which is Planck time space, right? And beyond that, you cannot make any observations in physics. Basically, what you get is nonsensical answers infinitely, right? Which is basically when you get that is a nonsensical answer. So beyond the measure of all the observations of space time are after the what you call the Planck time. Less than that, it's a fundamental constant of nature. Anything less than Planck time, you cannot make what you call observations about. So they don't know what's there before that. Now, one would have to argue, therefore, this is an assumption that people hold that something cannot come from nothing, simply because at the very philosophical basic level, the idea of nothingness or emptiness implies in itself the predicate of, and I'm repeating it, not having anything. So if you don't have anything, and here's the problem that, for instance, what's his name? Oh God, Universe from Nothing. Physicist at ASU.
Lawrence Krauss.
Lawrence Krauss, right? I read his book. I really like the guy a lot, and I sympathize with him. And I spoke to him last year, and he was really upset at philosophers. I told him I'm a philosophy major or whatever, and it was not because there was a scathing review of his on in
He's a very angry guy.
well, yeah,
Very
but he's jolly and angry at the same time. But the point is that there was a very scathing review by a Colombian philosopher of his book, and I read his book when I was in Dallas, and my father was there. And I must say, I was supremely disappointed by the book. From the very get-go, he commits a major strawman fallacy with it, right? He takes the idea of nothing, but saying, like, well, if you look in times of Einstein, Newton, people had the idea that there was the space was empty, and there was completely nothingness. And therefore, now, basically, we should recognize the fact that we have these microparticles coming out of space, therefore something is coming out of nothing. Well, the fact is, today we know we do no longer believe in what we call an absolute space, an empty space anymore. First of all, there's a great book written by Brian Greene called The Fabric of Cosmos that talks about our evolution of the idea of space-time and how we have gone away from the Newtonian absolute idea of space-time towards Mach, who agreeing with Kant, who said that space-time did not even exist at all, to an intermediate idea that space-time is relative. That is to say, there is something that exists. At the same time, it is not absolute, it can change. Time can slow down, space can expand or contract. It's something, the difference is this, and this is where he goes wrong. What he does not seem to realize is that if you assume materialism and all that exists is matter, then in that case, you have made no room for space or time, therefore yes, then space and time is nothing. But if you assume that another substance exists, the dimensional substance, and we know, it's like the material substance we assume exists, this all stuff is what we call matter. It's inert, we can do different things with it, we understand the chemistry of it, the physics of it, and we can work on it. There is something that exists in this universe other than that, that's called dimensions, space and time. And therefore they are not literally nothing. Now what came before space-time, what was that? And therefore, like I said, there are issues, you may disagree with the fact, and I granted the fact at the very beginning that this dichotomy of eternal versus temporal maybe is false. Perhaps, I fully do not understand this idea, but the general argument is that you cannot have what you call an infinite regression back in time. This is classic Zeno's paradox. That there was an infinite amount of, if there was an infinite amount of what you call, division between the distance from here to there, or let's say from here to there, then I could say it's impossible for me to walk from here to there because of divisions of infinite divisions. Therefore, clearly we have to assume that there were what we call finite amount of division from one place to the other place. And therefore, we have to assume the same thing about the time and for space as well too. Which should necessarily imply that there was something there before. Because Big Bang happened, we can empirically verify this. So you go back to the point of singularity, there had to be something there before that. It is not that the space-time itself, because remember at Big Bang, space-time itself made an appearance. Before that, we don't know what was there. And so, but something had to have been there. And this assumption that Krauss makes, that subatomic particles come out of space, out of nothing. Well, the problem is space is not nothing. So,
I don't know if he makes that claim though.
well, that was I read this entire book and
I did too. I didn't take that. I didn't assume that that's what he claimed.
Well, what would be your view of what he was saying?
Well, he was saying that he was talking about quarks coming out of existence, just what was not existent and then coming in and out of existence. But he didn't say that it came from nothing necessarily. I think it was a misuse of a word, and I think it was more to sell the book, if anything, or to sell the idea. But I don't think he was claiming that it really comes from nothing.
Well, the thing, you're right.
Or maybe our philosophical ideas about nothing are just
Right.
Useless, yeah.
This is why I got into astrophysics. At some point, it just stops being science and starts becoming.
Yeah, well, that's the
true.
interesting point.
Yeah.
At the frontiers of science, what you get is metaphysics. At the frontiers of physics, you really get metaphysics.
Yeah.
And not just as a discipline, but actually as far as the science is concerned. Yes, he says, and this is true, because it's what you have a non-causal effect from space, you see these things coming up, but it's still happening within what he calls space and time. As much as the Big Bang was a creation or at least the observable existence of space-time itself, what you have to realize is that there had to be something outside of space-time that would give birth to it. See, this is where the idea of multiverse actually comes in. Is where you have sort of a super universe that gives birth to these micro universes. Anyway.
But I've never heard him claim against the multiverse either. I know that he doesn't like the idea of it, but he's never said that it's not true or something that he argues against it not being possible. He still says it is possible. I've heard him say that as well. He doesn't like the idea of it, but he has to deal with the fact that.
Okay.
So I don't think he did claim nothing necessarily.
Okay, I guess we
I
may
don't
have a
know.
different understanding
Yeah.
of what he was saying then.
Yeah, that's true, because I've had the same conversation with other people.
Oh, okay.
You're not the only one.
Right.
Maybe I read it differently or saw it differently.
Okay, but going back to the personal ideas of these 5 fundamental axioms. So what else is there that somebody does not agree with or finds difficult to agree? Disagree with? Yeah.
I just said I agree with you, but the thing you just said is I feel like with the information people had, say 1,000 years ago, they were just as right to say the Earth is flat as you do to say that something can't come from nothing.
Well, the thing is, the idea becomes just that in order for something to exist, right, it has to have a cause. I have to have an explanation. That's what
That's a useful way that you've interacted with the world around you thus far,
Right.
but you have, I don't think you have any means by which to say that.
No,
The
see,
case
here's
is
the
over.
see, because it's not coming from
Turtles all
experience.
the way down.
Yeah, but see that. Okay, that's a very important point because this is what I'm saying is you cannot find proof of this in what you call experience. However, let's imagine a situation where you truly come across something that is that you cannot find any explanation for, right? Can you therefore say that that thing has no explanation?
No.
All you can say is what? I am not familiar with the explanation. But in order for something to exist, in order for you to make sense of something, I mean, either, unless it's, for instance, the only thing I can be familiar with in my own understanding of things is the ground of being, the absolute singularity, which you could never make any sense of. It is something that it must necessarily exist on its own. Let's say it's called nothingness. To use quibble on the word. That would be quite literally something that would never be explained. You have to accept it as what it is, and you know that there'll be no sufficient causal explanation for that will ever exist. But everything else out there that you can observe and you can measure or you can see, you can say that you do not know that what its explanations are, what's sufficiently caused it. But you will have to, in order to make any discoveries about it, you will assume that it actually had to have a cause. For instance,
You mean because that's the only useful way you can learn more about it?
absolutely, this is the idea of what's an existentially necessary assumption, existentially necessary axioms. These are necessary axioms to make intelligent conversation. For instance, abiogenesis, right? Here's the question: how did it happen? There are two assumptions. Well, the three or the aliens did it, but let's forget aliens for a second. Let's say either God did it, there was a miracle, matter started replicating, or it was the fact that there was a natural process through which just one second. Yeah, there was a natural process through which matter started replicating. Now, which one is it? Well, we don't know which one it is, right? But in order to study it, what is the assumption we're making? That there was a sufficient explanation, that there was some cause that was there that did it. Either it was God was a direct cause of it. That's what the intelligent design guys would say.
You're basically saying it was something.
Exactly. There was always, so the Parmenidean principle that something cannot come out of nothing is that in order to make any sense of anything, you're making an assumption that it came from something else.
Okay, I guess then this comes back to the reason that we were taking the poll that Adam suggested anyway, because, as far as interacting with the world, I completely agree with you, but I don't think, as far as making predictions about things that I can't empirically test, I can't accept that. And I don't think it's necessary for an intelligent discussion, as you said.
Okay, all right. I'll get back to it in a second. So.
Okay.
Did you guys go to the origins presentations?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pull Bill Nye and say,
Okay.
He's never
nothing,
touched that.
nothing is something.
Right. Dan, and then, I'm sorry for question.
No, that's all good, man.
Well,
So-
what is it? Okay.
His name is
So my objection
Probably
to
should at some
meet to the first 5 axioms would actually be the whole of axiom number 3. I don't think that's absolutely necessary to have an intelligent conversation. Parsimony.
Well, here's the thing. If you, again, parsimony is a simple assumption that we make. Again, it's not saying any particular thing is true or false. It's what you call a guideline idea or something. If you do not hold on to it, then let's say the Hume's delimiter. What you're saying is, I can assume more than what the evidence tells me to assume.
I would say yes, you can. There's nothing stopping you, and as long as it provides there's nothing. As long as you're accounting for the available evidence and the provides you a working knowledge of the universe, I don't see any reason why you should pursue parsimony. Parsimony is a good idea, and I pursue parsimony, but I don't think it's necessary to have a conversation about,
May I?
to make an intelligible universe.
Okay, let's say that we have explanation A and explanation B for a particular phenomenon, and both explanations take into account all the evidence that we have at present for this phenomenon. But explanation B happens to make more assumptions than explanation A. Parsimony says that according to probability, explanation A is probably going to be correct rather than B, because there are less unfounded assumptions that we're using. So the reason why it's necessary to continue a conversation, because again, if someone arguing for Proposition A and someone for Proposition B, they can both say, oh, all the evidence fits.
But it
But
doesn't.
there would be no other criteria by which they could argue which one is
More likely.
more probable.
Okay, so they can argue about which person.
Let me give you a concrete example of this. Let's just say, take 9/11 conspiracy theories, right? So let's take two possibilities. It was done by the terrorists, as the standard model suggests, or it was done by the US government. Now here's the thing. We know the facts as they are, right? So how the buildings collapsed, we know all that kind of stuff. So imagine, I assume that you do not believe in the 9/11 conspiracy.
That's correct assumption.
Okay. So in that case,
Does it, man?
imagine that I believe in 9/11 conspiracy, and I'm arguing against you. And we are not going to assume parsimony for a second. So what I'm saying is, look, you agree with the fact that buildings collapse. You agree with the fact that they collapse vertically, right? You further agree with the fact that there was, that there are people who heard detonations seconds before the buildings collapsed.
Yeah.
And you agree with the fact that the government did not scramble the air from the air bases. You know, they should have. These planes turned in the midair, and the Air Force, the jets, whatever, went a few seconds there or minutes, whatever, sufficiently enough. After the first attack happened, for the second attack, nobody was there as well too. So do you accept?
You can also see Obama's face in the smoke.
there you go, exactly.
Funny, man.
That's
I heard
your
Lucifer, not
So,
Well,
so
same
you agree
thing.
with this fact.
They're analogous.
If you agree with all these facts and they're undisputed, therefore my conclusion is correct. The U.S. government was responsible for 9/11 effects. But you will say, well, no, but look at other things that, other explanations. I was like, it doesn't really matter. If you're not going to assume parsimony, so what is the more reasonable explanation given? What's the one with the most untied, untied or unfounded assumptions? Then any conclusion. Now it's possible the U.S. government did it. It clearly is possible the U.S. government did it. But did it really happen? Did anything that's not logical contradiction is possible, which is more likely to say. Did Jesus walk on water? Well, it is possible. I mean, it's really violates the law of physics, but it is possible that man could have walked on water. But did it actually happen? If a person tells you that it actually happened, would you believe it? If I told you right now that, I just appeared in front of the door, literally materialized out of nowhere, and by the way, you have never had any single incident of me ever lying to you, would you still believe it?
No.
Well, no, because why? Again, parsimonious assumptions. There's too many. If I told you I ran over here and I got here, that makes sense because of your, your understanding of how the world actually operates. But I make a completely out of the, claim about things. That, of course, does not make any sense. And therefore, it could be the case that I actually had the technology to do that. But should you believe it? So then to have intelligent conversations about some things, we will have to assume that, well, that claim of me teleporting myself over here, unless I show you how I did it, it's probably not true. Probably. That's all the parsimony states.
Yeah, and I agree with the way you define parsimony. I just don't see it as absolutely necessary as an existential axiom, so to speak. It's not an axiom. It's a good idea, and it's something that it leads to a more parsimonious worldview. But it's not necessary to make a worldview. It's not necessary to make the universe more intelligent.
Well, okay, but I'll get your question.
Two things. One, Dan, it's just way too damn hard to take you seriously with the lay on your head, man. It's just
Fucking try.
I take
It's
it
not
more
going on.
seriously.
it's like
You need
the
to
reef of knowledge.
Take blood down.
But the second thing is going with that. Is it not a possibility that we're building a foundation or a pyramid of knowledge of acclamation on top of a foundation of false affirmation, and that we're leaning towards we're making these views based off misinformation in the first place?
Mhm.
Well, anything is possible. There's no logical contradiction. But the question, this is where it becomes an epistemic issue. It is about how do you know that you have false information in order for you to discern. So let's just say our world does not exist. We are plugged into some kind of a matrix form. How do you know which is true? How would you find out that you are in the matrix and to get to the real world? Anything to make any intelligent conversation about any stuff, you'll have to assume these things in the first place. So for instance, right now, it is very likely, well, it's not very likely, it's likely that I am not here. I'm merely imagining all this stuff because, I've been hypnotized or something of the kind. Or maybe this is just a dream that I have. Fine. But in this right now,
Possible, right, not likely.
no, that's right.
Possible.
Possible, not right, exactly.
What score would you
Right, yeah. But in
Yeah.
this world that I'm actually dreaming, so, I slap myself when I wake up in my bed.
Right.
But in this world right now, in order for me to make sense of it, whether it's true or false, I assume these things. And as an equally, when I wake up from it, I will know that this was a dream world based on these assumptions. My mind cannot escape these assumptions. And if you were to violate or escape these assumptions, you simply would have what you call a nonsensical existence.
And so how I see it though is that you put this together to see what is the most probable truth that we should be working towards, right? Is
No.
that the whole point of this?
No, what it says is these are the assumptions that make what you call the ability to discern what is true possible.
Right.
If you were, let's just stick to the first three, if you were to deny any of these propositions, your ability to make sense of anything that is possible will simply go away. So that's why these are what you call epistemic axioms, because the knowledge is based on these assumptions. You have to assume this in order to make any other claim. The other one, of course, are about reality or strategy of mind. So they're also not necessarily true, but they're of a slightly different category than the first three. So like I said, you cannot over here again. Forget the division between eternal and versus temporal, but simply talk about existence stuff. I said you have to assume there is a reality that's out there that you can understand. If there is no reality that you can understand, then what are you talking about? What are we even talking about then? Simply, it becomes a conversation stopper. It is like somebody says, my faith tells me that there is a triune God. Another person says, my faith tells me there is only one God, not triune. And third one says, my faith tells me there is no God. Well, and then by faith, of course, in this case, they simply mean what they believe, what they choose to believe, without any assumptions. How can you tell anybody what is right or wrong, what is true and false, which is a true assumption? All that is left, of course, is just mere feelings. That's what they mean. I feel there is a God. I need to feel for a God. I need for a salvation, a salvatory God, or I feel the need for having no God. But beyond that, nothing is happening.
Unless you can prove the existence of that God, right?
Pardon?
Unless you can prove the existence of that argument, right?
But here's the thing, though. In order to prove the existence of God, you have to assume these things in the first place. The law of identity. You have to assume that, of course, we can make what you call deductive, inductive, abductive arguments. We can make arguments from analogy. You have to assume that. You also have to assume parsimony, so that therefore, the question becomes, there are many gods, there's no God, there's one God, which is a more reasonable explanation. Well, again, based on whichever one is the most parsimonious is to be the most likely true one. And again, I want to clarify, Occam's razor does not mean the simplest explanation has to be right, which is the more popular version of Occam's razor. It simply says the one explanation that has the least unloose ends, so to speak, tends to be the right one. So again, given your basic experience in life and everyday existence, which is more likely? I came over here running from the parking lot, or I simply, a genie, I just, I close my eyes, open it up, and here you go, I was right over here. Which makes most, they're both possible, which is more likely? If you're going to say the latter, then, again, then I can come with something more fanciful. Then the thing is, and in this room we can talk about all the fanciful stuff, and it's really fun to talk about it. But let's face it, at the reality of the basic level, are you going to believe somebody? If I was to basically ask you to put a bet of $1,000 on which is the more likely proposition to which I came through, which one are you going to bet upon? So the parsimony is.
What if we take the genie thing just as a metaphor for how you guys?
Sure, but you will yeah.
I've got this image of Sinbad now.
Yeah, okay.
I was thinking Aladdin,
Yeah, Aladdin, right. But that's the thing is you have to, like I said, so it's actually in the sense it's a self-evident proposition that when you make these claims, you cannot take too, you cannot allow them to prove too much. Well, that's Hume's delimiter, to be precise. And so these are more like your guides, per se, as far as parsimony is concerned. You have to accept that as a guide. If you do not accept it as a guide, when you see people in religion or politics, when they make too bold claims, and you find them silly or incredible to accept those claims because they are always violating parsimony. They're assuming way too much than they should assume.
right?
That is all that is okay.
Take a poll again,
Okay, we will.
based off after the questions and everything, to see if anyone's
Sure,
changed
okay,
their position.
but let's take Adam first.
Sure.
Oh, going back to the something from nothing discussion, first of all, would you agree that whether something can come from nothing is closely related, if not just being a special case of, whether something can happen for no reason or without a cause, which is the same.
Let's put it this way, since it's, I would say, I would have, are you leaving?
Yeah.
Okay, by the way, we should wrap it up, so maybe next, right now after this question, or?
This is the last, their meeting, right?
Mhm.
It's the last one, yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Guys, do you wanna
We
do
we
Wednesday
can
this
discuss
summer?
discuss
Do
it
it!
at
Your place?
I
Whole
mean,
party?
Yeah. Yeah, in
Yes.
fact, we can discuss it on the page, so we can get everybody's.
Works.
input.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so let's do it in 5 minutes, right? Okay, so, to answer your question, I don't think that it's possible for me to
It's not really a
understand.
question, it's just a
Observation.
pre-question.
Yeah.
Was, because my question's not gonna make any sense unless you agree with it. Do you agree that whether something can come from nothing is very closely related to the question of whether something can happen for no reason?
No, I don't think, I would assume that anything that happens would have to have a reason. There is, this
This
is
is not what I
a,
asked.
That's not what he's saying, he's just saying that it's
Asked
just
whether these
related.
two concepts are basically the same concept.
okay,
I would
so
assume
the-
that you would agree. that
okay,
something
since
cannot
it said
happen
again,
for no
I'll
reason.
be following you.
Give me some info.
Do you agree that
Right, others.
whether something can come from nothing is closely related or basically the same question as whether something can happen for no reason?
Yes, exactly. I mean, this, yes, right. I think it was,
Yes,
you know, that's,
free
yeah.
question.
Something, nothing is the same thing as saying that everything has to have what you call an explanation for it.
I would do it.
So conversely speaking, what you're saying is true,
Okay.
they're related to each
So
other.
actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I think that somewhere in 4 and 5, you're actually taking a very significant position on quantum mechanics.
Mm.
Essentially, you're taking Einstein's position, which is generally seen as kind of like, well, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. His generation
Right.
died away. New generation of physicists accept quantum mechanics as it appears to be. But you seem to be saying, the same as Einstein, quantum mechanics cannot be right. It might be useful in the present, but it can't be right. Or another way of saying it is, it can't be complete. It can't be the final theory. So
What
is
is-
that the position you're taking?
Actually, no, I'm not taking the position, but what aspect of quantum mechanics do you think on which I'm taking the position?
In quantum mechanics is permeated with alternatives, which are chosen by a particle or a system for no reason.
For no reason.
Yeah,
See,
for no
the
reason.
funny thing is that in quantum mechanics, here's the thing, the observational data is correct. There are about 4 big, but overall 8 different understandings or theories of how this is actually happening. One of them also includes the idea what you call there's an underlying deep reality. The thing we have to realize is this, as far as quantum mechanics is concerned, is that science is fundamentally instrumental. It simply tells you if something is able to make predictions, radical predictions, therefore it will be taken as being, functionally true. It fulfills its purpose. It is not answering a deep underlying question. What I'm saying is that I'm not saying that when a person, let's say, a particle comes out of it and is able to, act, in whichever capacity. It is, I'm sure if I can actually answer the question right now, but Richard just said to me again, what does a particle do then? It simply comes out of it.
Over there.
Okay, we'll do that for dinner, okay. So.
Can I have one thing?
Oh.
Sure. Last comment,
I thought it was
just,
like-
it seems to me that